Hello everybody and welcome to the first video in our series of wars on the United States War of Independence. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know how many colonies were in America and who controlled those colonies. Second, you guys should know two aspects of life in colonial America. And third, you guys should know what the Navigation Acts are and how they impacted the relationship between the colonies and Britain. America at the time of the American Revolution consisted of 13 colonies. This meant that it consisted of 13 separate states. Each of the states had their own laws, their own religious preferences, their own economic activities, and they had ideologies that were all independent of one another. They were not a unified thing. These colonies were under the rule of the British Empire from their founding until the time of the American War of Independence. We are going to have a quick look at the founding of the first two colonies just to give us an idea of where we are and how that impacted on the native population. So the first successful English settlement was at a place called Jamestown, which we can see here. The Americans arrived there in May of 1607. The first settlement may have looked like this. It was named after King James I. This is the same King James I we met when we were looking at the Ulster Plantations. So this settlement, Jamestown, would eventually be in the state of Virginia. The land was inhabited by people, native people known as the Powhatan Confederacy. They allowed the English to stay as they could trade their extra food for guns, which Native Americans didn't have at the time. The English had hoped to find gold, and the colonists barely survived the first couple of years, but eventually they began to grow tobacco, which was a massively popular thing in Europe. It was part of what we know as the Columbian Exchange, which we met when we were talking about the age of exploration. And what they would have done is they would have set up successful tobacco plantations. Now, plantations are large estates where crops are grown. Again, it is not to be confused with the Ulster Plantations, which is a separate thing, even though it's the same word. They mainly would have used indentured servants to harvest this tobacco. So what an indentured servant was you would serve as essentially a slave for 7 years. You would sign up to be a slave for 7 years, and after this you would be set free. And you might be set up with your own plot of land. The reason this was so popular in the colonies is because it was cheaper to buy an indentured servant than to buy a slave from Africa, because you would eventually have to set them free after 7 years. But very few of them made it through the first 7 years, so it ended up being cheaper to buy an indentured servant who might die after 3 or 4 years and then buy another one. However, that does not mean that African slaves did not make an appearance, and the first African slaves arrived in 1640. And again, this would have been part of the Columbian Exchange of People, which we would have looked at. The second colony that was founded was found at a place called Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. This was founded in 1620 on the Mayflower ship. The people who founded it were known as the Pilgrims. These people wanted to find a colony where they could be free to practice their form of Protestantism, which was quite strict. They felt that the Church of England was too close to Catholicism. They were ill-equipped to survive and only did survive thanks to local Native Americans, in particular a man known to history as Squanto. And it is from this saving of the Pilgrims by the natives that the American tradition of Thanksgiving gets its origins. Unfortunately, as we saw in our exploration of the Aztecs and the Incas, disease absolutely devastated the local population. There are no clear figures, but it could be as high as up to 90% of the population was wiped out thanks to diseases such as smallpox and measles. Again, this is why people would believe that native populations would be quite nomadic and stuff like that, because our first real recordings of them would have been after they had been decimated by diseases such as smallpox and measles, which we met before. Again, this is feeding into that thing we met before, the Columbian Exchange. The Plymouth settlement eventually became part of the Massachusetts colony. You can see Plymouth here. Massachusetts is in the orange. And within this Massachusetts colony, the largest town would grow up to be Boston, which we will meet later on. There were other colonies around the area. New York was taken from the Dutch by the English. It had originally been called New Amsterdam. Pennsylvania had been given to a man called William Penn as payments, and Georgia had been set up as an attempted kind of utopian colony that didn't really work out. But all the colonies would have stopped at the mountain range. You can see here the Appalachian Mountains. That was as far as the colonies went. The structure then of the colonies themselves, each colony had a thing called a governor, and he was the king's representative. He was appointed by the crown. He was not elected within the colony themselves. Each colony also had their own assembly, which they would elect people to, and they would discuss things that were going on in the colony. But ultimately, the power lay with the king, the British Parliament, who would then give directions to the governor, who would then give directions to the assembly. Towns were particularly small in the colonies at the time. A lot of people had died in the establishment of the colonies. It took a long time for it to become a successful venture. However, by the 1750s, it was beginning to become quite successful. The population doubled between 1750 and 1770 due to high birth rates, lower death rates, and large immigration. And not just British, but Irish, Scots-Irish, and Germans also would have emigrated to the North America. Also, a lot more slaves would have been brought in at this time also. But just to show you the comparison, the largest town in the colonies around the time of the War of Independence was 23,750 in Philadelphia, whereas the population of London was 700,000 at the time. So a massive disparity in the size of the cities. The last thing we're going to look at is a thing called the Navigation Act. So the Navigation Act had been passed in the 1600s. The reason this was put in was to try to regulate trade within the empire. Remember, the British Empire was really growing at this point. Vasco da Gama had opened up a route into the Indian Ocean. The British Empire extended their power into places such as India, and they wanted to regulate trade within the empire. So they had this thing called the Navigation Act. But because America was so far away, it led to widespread smuggling within the US. Especially would have smuggled rum would have been a particular thing that was smuggled quite significantly at the time. And people tried to get away around this Navigation Act. However, in the 1760s, the acts were changed or amended, and now the purpose of them was not to just regulate the trade; it was to actually make money for the colonies, so that Britain wouldn't have to finance everything. So they wanted to generate a revenue, and this tighter imposition of the controls led to the colonies being very unhappy with British interference. And this is really the first thing we can look at that's going to cause problems for the British in the colonies. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So you guys should now know how many colonies were in America and who controlled them. The 13 colonies controlled by Britain. You guys should know two aspects of life in colonial America. We know it was quite hard when they landed there. Indentured servitude was part of that life. Slavery was part of the makeup of the time as well. Towns were particularly small. They didn't go past the Appalachian Mountains. And a few other aspects that we discussed there. And finally, you guys should know what the Navigation Acts are and how they impacted the relationship between the colonies and Britain. Mainly that the colonists were not happy that the acts were being enforced more tightly. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.